Hello, everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I used to think I knew all the paths leading into the forest north of town. I had been born and raised here for so many years. I knew every path and every old tree by heart. But then one day in early autumn, when the sky was thick with fog, I accidentally discovered a turn that I had never seen before. It was narrow, mossy, and seemed to have no footprints. A strange urge pulled me in, as if an invisible hand was guiding me. The path sloped gently, eerily silent. The sound of the wind was swallowed up, leaving only my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I walked deeper, and then the scene that opened before my eyes made me freeze. A vast lake. The water surface as still as a mirror, but the strange thing was that I had never seen it on any map. The townspeople had never mentioned it. A place completely hidden, as if it did not exist. The water reflected the overcast sky, and through the mist, I saw what looked like a silhouette standing just below the surface, staring up at me. I rubbed my eyes, but the image was still there, like an indelible ink stain. My skin crawled, my heart pounding. A chill ran down my spine. Not the chill of the autumn wind, but the presence of something not of this world. I remembered the stories the children in town used to tell on moonlit nights about places not to go. The chilling scares that grandparents told me to stay away from. They said there were cursed lands where time and space had separated themselves from the normal world. I had always considered them a lie to scare me. But now, standing in front of this lake, I began to believe that there were things that should never be explored. I knelt down at the edge of the lake, intending to scoop up some water when a strong wind blew, causing ripples to ripple the surface of the lake. A faint sound arose, like an endless whisper. I heard my name, repeated over and over again from the depths of the lake. The sound was not an echo. It was like there was someone right there, calling me in a voice filled with despair and ghostliness. Panicking, I retreated. On the shore, the old tree trunks seemed to bend down, blocking the light, plunging the entire area into heavy darkness. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. The lake seemed to have a pull, holding me back, forcing me to look at it. And then, under the water, a pale white hand slowly emerged, gently as if inviting me. I screamed and ran, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face, ignoring the slippery mud. When I turned back for the last time, I saw that the hand had disappeared, but the water surface still clearly showed the spreading ripples. I didn't dare tell anyone, because I knew no one would believe me. But from that night on, I could no longer sleep peacefully. In my dreams, I kept seeing myself returning to the lake, standing motionless before the figure under the water. And every morning when I woke up, my hand was soaked, as if I had just been immersed in that deep lake. After that first night of terror by the lake, I tried to forget it all. I told myself it was just an illusion, that fatigue and the thick fog had tricked my eyes. But the dreams kept recurring, and every time I closed my eyes, the image of that pale hand appeared. Worse, I began to hear a voice in my head, a faint whisper from somewhere far away but also very close. It called my name over and over again, just like that night. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, I returned to the forest, carrying a flashlight and a hunting knife to reassure myself. I told myself I would prove to myself that the lake didn't exist, that it was all a dream. But as I followed the same path through the dense bushes, I saw the lake open up before me again, as calm as the first time. I was stunned, realizing that I had entered a place that did not belong on the map. A dark place that no one had ever touched before. The lake was not calm this time. Instead, small ripples spread out, even though there was no wind. It was as if something was moving under the black water. I stepped closer, feeling the air around me thicken, the cold covering my skin. When I shone my flashlight on the water, the light was immediately absorbed, not reflected back. It was as if the lake was a dark mirror, swallowing all light and turning it into eternal darkness. At that moment, I heard laughter. It was not clear, but echoed from the depths of the lake. A distorted, disjointed laughter, as if it were made up of many voices overlapping each other. I froze, my hand holding the knife trembling. Then, from the middle of the water, the figure I had seen before appeared again. But this time, it did not just stand still. It slowly raised its head, its pale face revealed in the weak moonlight. Its eyes were empty and black, and a grin stretched from ear to ear. I instinctively backed away, but my foot tripped over a tree root and I fell. The flashlight fell away, leaving me in the dark. I heard the splashing of water, and when I looked up, I saw the figure crawling towards the lakeshore. Its gait was inhuman, its joints twisted, its movements jerky like a broken puppet. The sound of water dripping with each step made my heart stop. I ran, screaming as I ran, trying to escape that terrifying sight. But the sound still followed, like fingernails scraping wet soil. I didn't dare turn my head, but I could still feel it right behind me. When I was out of the forest, I collapsed to the ground, gasping as if I had just escaped death. At that moment, I could swear that a shadow had followed me out of the lake. From that day on, everything in my life changed. At home, I kept hearing knocks on the door in the middle of the night. But when I opened it, there was only darkness and a cold void. On the bedroom glass door, there were occasional long watermarks, like handprints sliding down. I tried to wipe them off, but the next morning, they came back. People in the house asked me why I was always absent-minded. My eyes were red, as if I had not slept. I did not dare to tell the truth, because if I told the truth, who would believe that I was haunted by a lake that was not on the map one night? I dreamed that I was sitting by the edge of the lake, and that person was sitting opposite me. He did not say anything, just stared. Suddenly, he reached out and placed his hand on my chest, and a cold wave pierced straight into my heart. I woke up, sweating like rain, but the cold feeling was still there. From that day on, I began to hear whispers whenever I sat alone. The sentences were unclear, like terrifying ghost stories told over and over again by the voices of the dead I tried to leave the town, hoping that this place would end. But the further I went, the more I saw the reflection of the lake in the rearview mirror, as if it were following me. And on the first night in the hotel, I heard the familiar knocking again. When I looked through the small hole in the door, I froze. Standing in the hallway, soaking wet, was the reflection from the lake, half of its smile torn off. After running away from the hotel, I returned home hoping that the familiar place would help me escape that invisible stalker. But after only a few nights, I realized that I was wrong. The house that I once considered a safe place now became a place filled with inexplicable phenomena. It started with small sounds, knocking on the wall in the middle of the night. Footsteps echoing from the attic where I never set foot. Then came the shadowy figures appearing at the end of the hallway, passing by when I turned my head, making my heart cold one rainy night. I was trying to sleep when I heard a whisper right next to my ear. I woke up with a start, but the room was still empty. The window was closed, the rain was pouring outside, but the air in the room was colder than outside. The glass door was covered with mist, and in the mist, a hand with 5 clear fingers slid down, leaving a long trail as if someone was standing outside the window looking in. I shivered and went over, opened the curtains, but outside was only a dark yard and pouring rain. There was no one, but the handprint was still there. From that night on, I began to see shadows appearing in the mirror. Every time I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, a faint figure would appear behind me. It stood still, not moving, but its empty eyes always followed. I turned around and there was no one, but when I looked back in the mirror, the figure was still there. The haunted stories I had read about suddenly became a horrible reality in my own home. Worse still, I began to hear voices calling me in my sleep. I dreamed that I was standing in front of a lake, and that figure reached out, calling me in a choked voice. Every time I tried to turn away, the dream immediately turned into a nightmare, where a cold hand gripped my neck, waking me up in despair. But when I opened my eyes, I found red marks on my neck, as if someone had really touched me. At first, I tried to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was too stressed. Maybe I imagined things. But when the neighbors started whispering that they saw a shadowy figure lurking in front of my house in the middle of the night, I knew I could no longer lie to myself. An old lady who lived across the street said she saw me standing on the porch, soaked, just staring at her house. But that night, I was sure I was sleeping in my room, the door locked tightly. So who was the person she saw? In the following days, the atmosphere in the house became heavy. The lights flickered constantly, darkness crept into every corner. Every time I walked up the stairs, I felt like someone was right behind me, their cold breath on the back of my neck. Once I tried to turn around, and in that moment, I clearly saw a pale face, with deep hollow eyes staring at me before disappearing into the air. I screamed loudly, ran outside, but when I returned, the house was still silent. As if nothing had happened, I started to write a diary to keep myself awake. But strangely, in the morning, the pages I wrote the night before were often torn or disappeared. One time, I left a notebook on the table. The next morning, it was on the floor. The pages were white, but full of scribbles, as if someone had written with water-based ink. I read carefully, and only recognized a few clear words. Ho, ... Go back. My whole body got goosebumps when I realized that it seemed like that figure had left a message that night. As I sat quietly in the living room, all the doors locked. I heard the sound of dripping water echoing throughout the house. But there was no leaking pipe. The sound of the drops of water grew closer and closer, until I saw the water spreading from the middle of the floor, gradually spreading into a puddle. In that puddle, the reflection was not the room, but the black lake where I had encountered that scary thing. I recoiled in horror, but from the reflection, a pair of empty eyes stared straight at Memi House had become a door leading straight to the lake. There was no longer any difference between where I lived and that place that should never have existed. I understood that I could not escape, because the curse had clung to me, dragging everything I loved into the vortex of horror. The haunted stories I had once considered fictional were now becoming pieces of reality, and I, helpless, could only sit and wait in fear, because with each passing night, the whispers became clearer and the figure came closer. After the terrifying nights in my own house, I began to understand that this haunting would not stop. No matter where I ran, the figure from the lake would find me, pulling me back to a place that did not exist on the map. My house was now just a mirror reflecting that mysterious horror. Every time I touched the floor, I felt the cold dampness, as if the whole house was gradually submerged in deep water. And when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw myself, but the figure that was increasingly clear, sitting motionless in the dark space of the lake. One evening, when the rain had just stopped, I heard the sound of scratching on the floor. The sound was dry, slow, like someone was dragging their fingernails on wood. I followed the sound to the living room and saw a large puddle in the middle of the floor. From it, small ripples spread, and the reflection in the water was not my room, but the misty surface of the lake. A figure crawled closer, rising from the bottom of the reflection. I threw the chair in a panic and smashed it into the puddle, but instead of splashing, it just swallowed it, dragging it away into the reflection of the lake. When I looked back, the floor was dry as if nothing had happened. From then on, I began to hear footsteps in the hallway, even when I was home alone. Doors opened and closed by themselves. One night, I woke up to find the window wide open, the curtains fluttering, even though I was sure I had locked it. Outside, a streak of water stretched from the fence to the main door, as if someone had come straight from the lake. I didn't dare to sleep anymore, just sat there holding the knife in my hand, my eyes glued to the door. Another night, I dreamed that I was back in the lake. The figure stood on the water, looking at me and smiling. But this time, it was no longer silent. It said, its voice echoing from the ground, "You have seen me, which means you belong to me." I woke up, cold sweat soaked my shirt, and my chest was imprinted with a wet handprint. I touched it and smelled the fishy smell of seaweed, the smell of death in the deep water. The scary stories I had heard as a child had never had such weight as this. Adults still told me that in the forest there was a cursed lake where the souls of the drowned wandered forever. I used to laugh at those stories, thinking they were just scares to keep children from getting lost. But now, when every detail of the story appeared right before my eyes, I understood that it was not just a scary fairy tale, but the bloody truth that was binding me during the day. I went out to the street to forget the feeling of horror, but even in the crowd, I still saw that figure. In the store glass, behind me was a pale face reflected. In the sound of cars, I still heard the familiar whisper. No matter how far I went, that lake still followed me. Outsiders looked at me like I was crazy, and I could only silently endure, because I knew, even if I told them, they would never believe me that night. I decided to try recording to find evidence. I put the recorder in my room and let it run all night. The next morning, when I listened to it again, my heart felt like it was being squeezed. Throughout the recording, the faint call repeated. A hoarse voice whispered my name. In the middle of the recording, the sound became clear, and I heard wild laughter, scratching at the door, and finally, that creepy voice, "You cannot escape." I threw the recorder to the ground, but those words still haunted me. As if engraved in my brain, my house was no longer where I lived, but the lake that I used to step into this world. With each passing day, the boundary between the house and the lake became more blurred, and I knew one day I would no longer wake up in my bed. I would wake up under that pitch black water, facing that smile that ripped my face apart, forever a part of this horrible mystery. I began to realize that this presence was no longer just a dream or a distant lake. It had followed me home and turned every familiar corner into a dangerous place. One morning, when I woke up, a series of wet footprints appeared on the bedroom floor. They started at the door and stopped right next to my bed. My heart pounded, as I looked down at my dry feet. That meant someone or something had been standing there, right next to my bed, while I slept. I mustered up the courage to wipe the footprints away, trying to convince myself that it was just an illusion. But at night, when I turned off the lights, they reappeared, this time more clearly, as if the invisible being wanted me to see. I was afraid and closed the door tightly, placing furniture in front of it. But in the middle of the night, there was a sound of dragging on the floor, and when I turned on the lights, all the furniture blocking the door had been moved aside, leaving a straight path to the bed. I screamed, but my screams echoed in the cold void. The next day, I went to the town library, hoping to find some clue about the strange lake. After hours of searching, I discovered an old, moldy document. In it was a record of a series of disappearances from nearly a century ago. A group of hunters went deep into the forest and never returned. The villagers found only muddy traces leading to an area that was not marked on the map. The last lines mentioned a deep, black, bottomless lake where drowned souls could never rest. My hands trembled as I read, because every detail matched what I had seen. That night, when I returned home, I found the front door ajar. I clearly remembered locking it before leaving. Inside, a strong fishy smell rose, exactly like the smell of algae from the lake. Water dripped from the ceiling to the floor, forming puddles. When I looked up, I was stunned. On the ceiling, reflected in the water, was the pale face of that shadow, its empty eyes staring straight down at me. I backed away, slipped, and fell into the puddle. And in that moment, I clearly saw a pair of cold white hands reaching out from the puddle, trying to pull me down. I jumped up, ran out of the house, but when I looked back, the figure had disappeared. I began to understand that my house had become a gate connecting to the lake. Wherever I went, it still found a way to follow me. I tried sleeping at a friend's house, but on the very first night, they were also startled to say that they heard footsteps in the hallway, the sound of water running in the bathtub, even though no one turned on the faucet. I knew I had accidentally brought something with me, and now it haunted wherever I went from that day on. I lived in a state of constant vigilance. I did not dare to look in the mirror, did not dare to enter a dark room, did not dare to close my eyes for too long. But the more I avoided it, the more clearly it appeared. Sometimes I see a shadowy figure standing outside the window, motionless, looking in. Sometimes I hear whispers right behind me, but when I turn around, there's only emptiness. And last night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and an invisible hand gently placed on my shoulder. I froze, not daring to breathe. Then a voice rang out, deep and hoarse. "You belong there." I got up, turned on the light, but the room was completely empty. On the floor, only wet handprints remained. I knew I had no time. The shadow was getting closer than ever, and I wouldn't be able to resist forever. What I was experiencing was not only scary, it was so creepy that it was making my mind crack. I didn't know how much longer I could hold out before I was pulled down into the depths of that lake. I knew I couldn't continue living in fear without finding out the truth. If the lake really existed and was haunting me, there would surely be clues in the town's old records. I went to the archives building, a place few people went to. It was dusty inside, the heavy bookshelves stacked on top of each other, and the musty air made it hard to breathe. I flipped through files, old newspaper clippings. Then I stopped when I saw a file with the faded words, "Missing 1923. I opened it with trembling hands. The yellowed pages told a story the town had tried to forget. That year, a group of 12 villagers had gone hunting in the woods. They left in the fall and never returned. When the search party arrived, they found only a few scattered items: a rusty gun, a water-soaked backpack, and footprints leading straight into a forest not marked on any map. The conclusion was hastily written: cause undetermined. Case closed. I flipped through the other files, discovering a series of disappearances spanning decades. There was a mushroom picker, a lost child, a couple who went camping and never returned. All of them disappeared in that forest. A few rare witnesses said they saw a flickering light in the middle of the forest, heard a mysterious call from the darkness, and saw a lake that never appeared on the map. They described exactly what I had experienced. I read this. My heart felt like it was being squeezed. True scary stories were no longer just word of mouth. They were clearly recorded in official documents. In a separate file, I found faded black and white photos. They were of a foggy forest, and in the middle was a still water surface. In one photo, if you looked closely, you could see the vague silhouette of a woman standing in the middle of the lake, her long wet hair covering her face. In another picture, a pale arm emerged from the water. I felt a chill run down my spine, my hands shaking so much that I almost tore the photo. I took the documents home, hoping to find a way to escape this obsession, but the very act seemed to have triggered something. That night, I heard the rustling of papers in the living room. When I went downstairs, I saw the files I had brought scattered on the floor, and on the damp wall appeared the words in water, "Return to me." I tried to wipe them away, but the more I wiped, the more clearly they were written. When I fell asleep, the dream took me back to the lake, but this time it was no longer a blur. I clearly saw the silhouette of the woman in the photo standing right in front of me. Her face was pale, her eyes were deep black, and her mouth spoke in a resounding voice, "You have entered my land. You cannot escape." I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. When her hand touched me, I woke up with a start, my whole body cold, as if I had just been soaked in ice water the next morning. I found the photos had disappeared. Only the white paper, stained with salt water, remained. I sat motionless, realizing that I had gone too far, had touched something I should not have touched. That lake did not want to be mentioned, and anyone who dug up the truth would have to pay the price. I felt like there were thousands of invisible eyes watching my every move that night. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, I no longer saw myself. Instead, there was the image of the black lake, and the shadow of that woman standing on the shore, smiling coldly. I smashed the mirror, but even as the glass fell, I could still see the water reflected in each piece. I screamed, but my screams only echoed back, exactly like the stories in the old records. I understood that the lake was a part of the town, of the history that people try to bury. It doesn't appear on the map because it was never part of this world. It is the rift between life and death, where all lost souls are swallowed. And one, whether I want it or not, have become a part of that horrible cycle. After reading the files and seeing those horrifying photos, I could no longer distinguish between reality and dreams. My house was filled with a gloomy atmosphere, and every step I took echoed with the sound of water splashing from the deep lake. The mirrors I had broken were still scattered on the floor, but instead of reflecting my reflection, each piece showed the image of the quiet lake and the silhouette of a woman standing motionless. I gathered them up and threw them in the trash, but the next morning they appeared intact on the table, shining as if they had never been broken. One evening, I was sitting at my desk when I heard a faint cry coming from upstairs. The cry was weak and choked, like that of an abandoned child. I trembled as I took the flashlight and walked up, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened the door to the empty room in the attic, I saw a large puddle of water on the wooden floor. In the puddle, a faint image of a child appeared, its empty eyes looking at me. I was so scared that I backed away, knocked on the door, and ran away. The cry suddenly turned into a creepy laugh. Echoing throughout the house the following nights, I heard a knock on the door regularly at 3 in the morning. Every time I looked through the small hole, I saw the figure of a woman with long, wet hair standing on the porch, motionless. The cold wind blew through the crack of the door, carrying a fishy smell, making me nauseous. One time, I mustered up the courage to quickly open the door, but in the yard there was only darkness and wet footprints leading to the gate. I knew I could no longer control anything. All the haunted stories that people had passed down were now happening in my life. I went to the old priest in town, who had witnessed many strange phenomena. He listened to my story, his eyes narrowed with anxiety. He said that the place I saw was not an ordinary lake, but a gate between the world of the living and the wandering souls. It existed to retain the wronged souls that could not be released. He advised me never to return, and better leave town before it was too late. But I knew there was no turning back. The lake was attached to me, and it would follow me wherever I went. That night, I dreamed that I was being dragged into the lake. The icy water covered my body. The hands of dozens of drowned people grabbed me. Pale, distorted faces appeared everywhere. They said nothing, only opened their mouths to reveal dark holes. I struggled, but to no avail. The force from below pulled me deeper and deeper. At the moment of suffocation, I woke up. My whole body was soaked. The floor under my bed was also soaked with water the next morning. My neighbors said they heard me screaming in the middle of the night. But when they knocked on the door, no one answered. I didn't dare tell them about the nightmare, for fear they would think I was crazy. But I knew it wasn't a dream, because my body was still shivering from the cold, and the smell of moss still clung to my skin. I started recording and filming everything in the house, hoping to prove that I was not crazy. And in the first tape, I saw clearly while I slept. A figure stood in the corner of the room, motionless, watching me for hours. The house, the dream, and the lake were now one. I could no longer escape. The haunted stories of the previous people had become reality, and I was the next one to be dragged into this terrifying loop. I clearly felt that with each passing day, the boundary between me and them was disappearing. One day, I would no longer wake up in this familiar room, but would wake up at the bottom of the dark lake, among the immortal ghosts. After the files disappeared and the woman's face appeared in each piece of broken glass, I knew I was marked. I was no longer just a casual witness to a secret, but a part of it. Wherever I went, traces of that lake followed me. In the house, on the street, even in the eyes of the people around me, I felt like something was staring at me. The shadows around me seemed to come alive, clinging to my every breath. One evening, I tried to find peace by sleeping in the living room, leaving the lights on and the TV on to drown out the silence. But when the screen was showing normal images, it suddenly flickered and turned into a lake scene. I was stunned. The remote control fell from my hand. On the screen, the woman with long, wet hair slowly approached, her smile clearly showing. Then she pressed her face close to the lens. Her dark eyes seemed to want to suck me in. I pulled out the power cord in horror, but the screen remained on. reflecting the quiet lake, as if the TV had become a mirror connected to that place after that night. The phenomena in the house became more intense. The knocking on the door no longer stopped at 3 a.m., but rang out at any time. Puddles appeared everywhere, in the kitchen, the bedroom, even right in the middle of my bed. One time, while mopping the floor, I clearly saw a pale hand emerge from the puddle, trying to grab my ankle. I screamed loudly, swung the knife down, but the hand dissolved into water, leaving the floor dry as if nothing had happened. I sat down, a feeling of despair tightening in my chest. Decided to try leaving town, driving through the night to another place. But the further I went, the more unfamiliar the scenery on both sides of the road became. And then suddenly, when I turned a corner, I found myself stopping in front of that lake. The lake was as calm as a mirror. The cold moonlight reflected down, and the silhouette of a woman stood waiting. I screamed, turned around and ran, but it seemed like every road led me back to that place. It was as if there was no way out. After hours of despair, I turned back, realizing that I was tied to the lake, unable to escape. The next night, I dreamed that I was sinking to the bottom of the water. Beneath the black water, countless distorted faces were screaming silently. They were people who had been missing for decades. Each face glared at me, as if blaming, as if begging, as if cursing. I felt each cold hand pulling down, tearing my clothes, scratching my skin. The painful, suffocating feeling was too real to be a dream. When I woke up, my body was covered in purple scratches. The smell of pond mud and moss filled the room. The next morning, I found a wet piece of paper on the table. The words appeared in patches. "You will never leave." I tried to tear it apart, but when I turned back, it was still in the same place, the writing clearer. I trembled with fear, realizing that I was not only haunted, but also being gradually drawn towards the lake. My mind was getting tired, my body was getting weaker, as if life was slowly being drained away. I remembered what the priest said, that lake was the gate between life and death. I began to believe that those spirits did not simply want to drag me away, but wanted me to become one of them, a new piece for the lake to swallow. What I was experiencing was no longer just strange phenomena. It had gone beyond the limit, turning into an inevitable sentence. This was one of those true horror stories that people never dared to write, because no one survived long enough to tell it all. That night, when the clock struck 3 a.m., I did not hear the knocking on the door anymore. Instead, the main door slowly opened and a cold wind rushed in. I sat there, knife in hand, heart pounding. From the porch, the shadow of a woman walked in, slowly, water dripping with each step. She approached, stopping in front of me. Her dark eyes pierced through my mind, and her voice echoed, "You belonged to me from the moment you saw the lake." I screamed, dashing back, but when I turned back, the room was empty. There was only the puddle of water and the stench of fishy smell. I knew that the end was near. There was no salvation anymore. The ghost stories that I had once despised had now become an undeniable reality, and I, powerless, could only write it all down, hoping that at least someone out there would know that this lake really existed. But if someone reads this story, I have only one piece of advice. Never go looking for it, because once you see it, you will never escape. After the night she walked straight into the house, I could no longer find any peace. Even during the day, the sunlight could not dispel the gloomy feeling that pervaded the place. Water stains began to appear on the walls. At first just a few small streaks, but then spread into distorted shapes. Once I looked closely, I realized that they formed faces. Empty eyes, mouths wide open as if screaming in silence. I rushed to wipe them away, but a few minutes later, those water faces returned, more numerous. Clearer, the sounds in the house became more dense. At night, there was not only the knocking on the door, but also the sound of footsteps circling around my bed. I lay still, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to explode. Each step was accompanied by the sound of dripping water, as if someone was leaking water from his own body. When I mustered up the courage to open my eyes, I saw a thick darkness gathered in the corner of the room, from which two dim lights flashed, like eyes staring at me. I didn't dare move, just praying for morning to come quickly. I tried to leave the house, going to an old friend's house to ask for a place to sleep. But on the first night, they woke me up in a panic. They said there was a knock on the door in the middle of the night. Then someone whispering my name echoed through the hallway. When they opened my door, they found me sitting upright on the bed, eyes wide open, but I didn't remember anything. They panicked, begged me to leave, not daring to let me stay another night. I walked out of their house in despair, realizing that the shadow was not only following me, but also causing terror to anyone who came near in a panic. I went to a paranormal research group. I told them everything that had happened, showed them the recording and the scratches on my body. They were skeptical, but still decided to come to my house to investigate. That night, they brought cameras, measuring devices, and many other devices. At first, the house was unusually quiet, but then, at exactly 3 a.m., everything started. The camera automatically turned to the main door, where the door opened by itself. A cold air rushed in, and in the lens, the silhouette of a woman from the lake slowly walked in. The research team was panicked. One person ran away immediately. The other two tried to continue filming, but the camera simultaneously turned off. The next morning, they left. No one dared to come back. Only I had to face this horrifying truth. I began to feel my body getting weaker day by day. Every morning when I woke up, my clothes were wet as if I had just soaked in water. I often woke up with a violent cough, vomiting black water that smelled of algae. I was scared to look in the mirror and saw my skin pale. My eyes were dark and my breathing was getting weaker. Sometimes I wonder if I drowned the first time I saw the lake, and all I am living is a meaningless extension of a soul that has been swallowed by the lake one afternoon. I sat down to read the old documents again, hoping to find some hope. But instead of clues, I only found more records of disappearances similar to mine. A handwritten note scrawled, "Once you see, you cannot escape." I threw the paper to the ground, my heart pounding. I understood that I was just the next character in that chain of fates. Creepy stories do not exist only to scare, but to warn the curious. And I was living proof of that night. I decided to try to face it one last time. I sat in the middle of the living room, the lights flickering, my hand clutching the knife. At exactly 3 a.m., the door opened again. The woman walked in, slowly, water running across the floor. I screamed, rushed forward, and swung the knife. But the blade only pierced empty air, and my body suddenly turned cold. I collapsed, and in that moment, I found myself no longer in the living room. Before me, the black lake stretched out, and from the water, hundreds of ghosts were rising. Reaching out to May understood that the game was over. There was no escape, no salvation. What I wrote here was my last breath before disappearing. If anyone is listening to this story, consider it a warning. Do not seek out the lake that is not on the map, because once you see it, you will become a part of it, just like me. I used to read a lot of short, scary stories online, short stories about ghosts, curses, or strange phenomena. But I never thought that one day I would become a character in such a story. Now, every detail I experienced was short, sharp, and terrible, like a story written to instill fear. It was no longer a long series of days, but each fragment, each separate scene, enough to make my heart clench. I remember one night when I had just fallen asleep. The knocking on the door rang again. This time, it was not urgent, but slow. Each beat seemed to hit my mind. I sat up. The room was dark. Only the weeknight light was on. I walked to the door, pressed my ear to the wood, and listened. There was no other sound, only the sound of my heart beating. I gathered up the courage to open the door, and there was no one on the porch. But as soon as I closed the door, a whisper sounded close to my ear. "I have entered." I jumped up, turned around the room, but saw only the dense darkness that was closing in the following days. Every detail in the house gradually changed. The bathroom mirror no longer reflected me every morning, but instead showed the image of a black, rippling lake. On the dining table, the glass of water I had just filled suddenly turned into a dark, fishy liquid. I dropped it on the floor, and when it broke, the liquid immediately evaporated, leaving the tile floor dry as if it had never been there. I began to realize that the lake was not only haunting my dreams, but was gradually replacing all the reality in my life one morning. When I woke up, I found myself lying on the floor instead of on the bed. The room was unfamiliar. The walls were covered with moss. The air was humid. The fishy smell of pond water was thick. I panicked and crawled up, but when I opened the door, in front of me was the familiar lake. I screamed, closed my eyes tightly, and when I opened them, I found myself back in bed. But my whole body was soaked. The sheets and pillows were covered in mud and moss. I trembled, knowing that the boundary between dream and reality had disappeared as time went on. The horrifying details became more concise and clear, like the rhythm of short, scary stories. One evening, I was eating dinner when I saw the shadow of a woman sitting opposite me, silently looking at me. I blinked, and she disappeared, leaving only the empty chair. Another time, I heard someone calling my name from the sink. When I bent down, I saw a pale face reflected in the water, smiling from ear to ear. I jumped back, knocking over a pile of dishes, but when I looked back, the sink was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. The situation reached a climax when I began to see the missing people appear. In the hallway, I saw a group of men wearing old clothes, pale skin, and lifeless eyes. They passed me, not paying any attention, then disappeared into the darkness. On the stairs, a child sat, huddled, sobbing. But when I approached, it raised its head, its empty eyes staring straight at me, then vanished into smoke. I knew I was living with them, the souls trapped by the lake. And I was just the next in that endless list. I started writing everything down, not to find a way out, but to warn. Every line I wrote was shaky, but I hoped at least someone would read it and stay away from that place. I knew that once the lake found you, it would never let you go. And whether you believe it or not, I can only confirm this is no longer a legend, it is the truth. The short, creepy stories you have read have become my life, and I am the living proof of their existence tonight. I sit, writing in the flickering light, listening to the sound of water dripping around me. I am no longer sure if I will live to write tomorrow. But if you're listening to this, remember, Short, scary stories may just be stories to you, but to me, they're the truth, an inescapable sentence. I no longer knew where the line between everyday life and nightmares was. Every morning when I woke up, my body felt heavy, as if someone had pressed it all night. Bruises appeared on my arms and legs, imprinted like the marks of a human hand. I started recording each strange event with a video camera, but when I reviewed the tapes, they turned into a blank screen, leaving only a mysterious whispering sound. The voice repeated, "You belong to the lake, you have been chosen." One afternoon, I tried to leave the house and walk around town to find some peace. However, everything around me seemed to have changed. Instead of reflecting myself on the storefront, I saw the image of the familiar lake. In the park, a swing swung by itself despite the lack of wind. A child sat there, hair soaked, wearing tattered clothes, looking up at me with empty black eyes. When I turned away in shock, the swing was empty, leaving only a cold, creaking sound that night. I returned home in a state of panic, but the horror did not stop there. As soon as I stepped into the living room, the lights suddenly went out. In the darkness, I heard footsteps circling around me. I quickly turned on the flashlight. The light hit a figure standing against the wall, pale skin, water dripping from hair to the floor. I screamed loudly, but the figure vanished like smoke, leaving the floor wet. I could no longer deny it. The paranormal stories I had read for entertainment were now replaying in my own life the next day. I invited a close friend to stay over to have a witness. He initially laughed at me, thinking I was too nervous, but at midnight, when a familiar knock sounded on the door, he decided to open the door to take a look. At that moment, cold wind rushed in, and on the ground were clearly wet footprints going deeper into the house. My friend was terrified, pale, and kept backing away. Then he screamed when he saw a woman's face with deep black eyes appear from the corner of the room. He ran away, never to return. I stood there, dumbfounded, knowing that I had lost my chance to prove to anyone that I was not crazy. I went to a famous paranormal researcher in the area. He listened to me and sighed, saying that the lake was an ancient portal that had swallowed countless souls over the centuries. He warned that the more I resisted, the deeper I would be pulled. The only way was to face it, but he did not say how. I left in despair, realizing that even those who knew the most about paranormal stories could not save me. The following nights, I barely slept. When I did, I found myself standing in the middle of the lake. The ghosts around me whispered, their soulless eyes watching me. They reached out as if to pull me down with them. Every time I woke up with a start, the bedsheets were soaked. My breathing was heavy as if I had been drowned. I began to fear my own room, fear all sleep, because I was not sure if the next time I opened my eyes, I would still be on the ground. One morning, looking out the window, I saw a group of people standing motionless in the yard. They were dressed in clothes from many different periods, from ancient hunters to modern people. All were soaked, their lifeless eyes staring straight at me. I blinked, they disappeared, but the puddles of water still remained on the ground. I trembled, knowing that these were the missing people that the lake had swallowed. And now they only existed as reminders to me. I was slowly being erased from real life. Friends shunned me, neighbors whispered, and my body grew weaker by the day. The bruises became sores, my skin became paler. I looked in the mirror and saw that my eyes were gradually losing their light, replaced by a deep darkness. I was horrified to realize that I was becoming one of those spirits. The lake didn't need to drag me away, because I had transformed myself into one of its own. This is no longer a story to scare or warn. This is the naked truth. An invisible sentence hanging over my head. And if you are listening to these words, know that the lake is still waiting. It is not on any map, but it will find you if you are curious. And then you will understand paranormal stories do not exist only in books or legends. They live, they breathe, and they will swallow you as they swallowed me. After all those long, haunting nights, I realized that the presence had found a new way to torment me. It was no longer just a shadow or a whisper in the dark. Now, I saw things moving, coming to life, like a horror movie playing right in my room. I sat on a chair, watching the walls tremble, the water stains turning into human shapes, slowly moving. Long arms slithered out, as if to grab me. I closed my eyes tightly, but when I opened them, the figures were still there. Alive and writhing. Another night, I saw my ceiling change. It gradually became the surface of a lake, ripples spreading, reflecting the pale blue moonlight. I saw the woman slowly rise, her wet hair covering her face, but her body moving like a warped cartoon. Her hands jerked, her joints creaked, her smile was so wide it was unbelievable. I was terrified, but I couldn't look away, as if I was forced to watch a horror movie scene over and over again, the animated horror stories that I had once considered mere entertainment had now become reality around me. Everything in the house seemed to have its own soul. The old doll in the corner of the room suddenly turned its head, its black, lifeless eyes darting around. The wall clock stopped at exactly 3 in the morning, but the hands still moved jerkily, making a creaking sound like broken bones. The windows projected ripples of water, even though it was dry outside. I felt like I was living in a cursed movie, where all the objects around me turned into dead characters one evening. I tried to record a video with my phone to record the evidence. When I played it back, I found myself sitting alone in the room, but surrounded by dozens of moving ghosts. Some stood behind me, others crawled up from the floor, all staring at me. The short video gradually blurred, ending with a clear view of the lake, and from within it, the woman's eyes pressed close to the lens. I threw the phone, my heart pounding, my whole body shaking. But when I picked it up, the video had disappeared, leaving only a black screen. The nightmare didn't stop there. I started to see ghostly images appearing even when I was not at home. On the sidewalk, water reflections of faces crawled along with my every step. On the wall of the coffee shop, I saw a blurry figure crawling from corner to corner, making me scream loudly in the crowd. People looked at me like I was crazy, and I knew that I couldn't explain to anyone. What I was experiencing could only be described with a single phrase: animated horror stories come to life in real life. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering around me. The room was dark, but lit by an eerie blue light. On the wall, a series of images appeared like a movie playing. I saw the missing people, the people being dragged into the lake, the people screaming in despair. The image was blurry, distorted, but moving like it was real. I saw myself in it, struggling between cold hands. I stood there, numb, knowing that this was not a warning. This was the inevitable future. I knew that time was running out. My body was getting weaker and weaker. My spirit was draining. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself in a new scene, where everything was more and more horrible. And when I woke up, the traces of that scene were still imprinted on my body. Scratches, bruises, soaked clothes. I could no longer distinguish between reality and the cursed film that the lake was showing. Only one thing was certain. I would soon no longer be me. I would be just another ghost in that endless story. I used to think that the biggest fear was when I had to face something directly. But no, the biggest fear was when I had to sit alone in the dark, listening to every sound and knowing for sure that I wasn't really alone. Tonight, I tried to stay in the living room, telling myself that I would overcome it. I locked all the doors, pushed the chair against the window frame, and placed the knife right next to it. I turned on all the lights in the house, trying to create some sense of security. But deep in my mind, I knew that light couldn't stop what was coming. The ticking of the clock echoed in the silent house. I sat on the chair, my eyes looking around, my ears listening. Suddenly, from upstairs, there was the sound of footsteps dragging slowly. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard that it felt like it was going to tear my chest. I knew I was home alone, no one else in the house. So where did those footsteps come from? I took the knife and walked step by step up the stairs. Each step seemed to last forever. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the sound of dripping water. When I opened the bedroom door, the room was empty, but the floor was stained with water, imprinted with footprints. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The door behind me suddenly slammed shut, locked from the inside. I yanked it open, but it wouldn't open. In the darkness, a faint breathing sound echoed close to my ear. I turned the flashlight back, and as soon as the light touched the corner of the room, I saw a figure standing there. Long hair covered his face. His whole body was soaked. I screamed, rushed to knock on the door, and when I turned back, the corner of the room was empty. But the wooden floor was still damp, and the fishy smell still lingered. I turned back to the living room, my heart pounding. But the scene down there was even more horrible. Every chair, table, and furniture in the room had been moved, arranged in a circle. In the middle of the circle, a large puddle of water spread out, rippling even though there was no wind. I saw my reflection in it, but it didn't move with me. Instead, it stood still, then slowly turned around, its black eyes staring straight at me. I backed away, the knife falling from my hand. My mouth dry and unable to speak, ran straight to the front door, but the lock was gone. Instead, there was only a cold wooden board, as if there had never been a door. I ran around the house in a panic, but every door and window was gone, replaced by damp, moss-covered walls. The house had transformed, no longer a shelter, but an extension of the lake. I was completely imprisoned. I realized this was why all the stories about Home Alone were always haunting. When you are left alone, you have to face the fact that no one will come to save you. Whispers began to echo from all around. I could no longer hear the words, only feel the desperation and hatred in the voices. The ceiling dripped water, each drop falling coldly on my face. I looked up and saw the woman's face reflected in the water, a smile that reached from ear to ear. I screamed, covering my ears, but the laughter still echoed in my head. I collapsed to the floor, a cold feeling creeping up from the floor. I shivered, trying to crawl away, but all around me was darkness and water. I knew I didn't have much time. The ghosts from the lake had invaded the house, and I was the only prey in this game. I felt each invisible footstep approaching, each cold breath on the back of my neck. I closed my eyes, praying for morning, but I knew that the light couldn't dispel what had clung to me. Tonight, I was truly home alone, and this loneliness could be the last night of my life. Tonight, it rained heavily, the drops of water pounding loudly on the roof tiles, flowing in streams through the window frame. The sound of rain always made me feel safe because it covered up all the strange sounds in the house. But this time it was different. Between the steady rain sounds, I heard unusual breaks. Sometimes the sound of rain turned into a murmur like a whisper. Sometimes it echoed like footsteps on wet wooden floors. I strained my ears to listen, and my heart turned cold when I realized it was not my imagination. The sound of rain had mixed with the sounds of the spirits from the lake I sat by the window, watching the raindrops glisten down the glass. In each streak of water, I saw faces appear for a moment and then disappear. Their eyes were black, their mouths wide open, their smiles crooked. I rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, the faces were still there, even clearer. I quickly pulled the curtains back, but from the darkness, I could still hear the sound of scratching on the glass. As if someone was trying to get in that night, I lay on the bed, trying to close my eyes to forget. But the sound of the rain kept changing. Sometimes it sounded like a mournful song, sometimes like someone sobbing. I opened my eyes, saw the ceiling dripping, each drop of water falling on my face coldly. When I wiped it away, I was startled to realize that it was not rainwater, but a murky liquid, fishy and smelling of moss. I sat up, coughing, while the sound of the rain outside suddenly turned into a steady tapping sound. As if someone was knocking on my door, I gathered all my courage and walked out into the hallway. The house was dark, with only a pale blue light coming from the cracks in the door. With each step, I heard the sound of dripping water following closely. When I went down to the living room, the scene left me speechless. The floor was ankle deep in water, but the sound of the rain outside did not get louder. I looked around, and in the middle of the room, the silhouette of the woman from the lake was standing there. Water flowed from her body, mixing with the water at my feet. She raised her head, smiled widely, and the sound of the rain immediately turned into a creepy laugh that echoed everywhere I screamed. Ran back up the stairs, but the sound of the water splashing with each step made me feel like I was wading in the lake. Entering the bedroom, I locked the door tightly, huddled in the corner. But the sound of the rain did not stop, even louder, as if the whole house was submerged in a storm. I heard the knocking on the door getting louder, then a whisper, "Open, .. I trembled, holding my head, praying for the morning. But at that moment, the door shook violently. Water leaked through the cracks, flowing in streams on the floor. I knew I didn't have much time left. The next morning, everything disappeared, as if it had never happened. The floor was dry, the windows were tightly closed. There was no trace of water. But in my ears, the sound of last night's rain still echoed, persistent, like a deathly song that never stopped. I realized that even when the rain stopped outside, I could still hear it in my head, drawing me closer and closer to the lake. The familiar rain sounds had turned into the call of the other world, and I could only wait for the day I would be swept away. I used to be a sucker for creepypastas online, the short, spooky, mysterious stories that only gave me a brief shiver before I turned off the screen. I never believed they could be true, but now my days felt like a cursed story someone had written, and I was just living it word for word. One night, I sat in front of my computer, trying to find an explanation for the lake. I typed in keywords related to disappearances, forgotten legends, but instead of the usual results, an old forum appeared on the screen, the interface blurry as if it no longer existed. There was a post titled, "The Lake That Should Not Exist." I clicked on it, and my heart sank as I saw every detail exactly like what I had experienced. the bushy path, the shadow in the water, the knocking at the door at 3 a.m. The writer said he had seen the lake, was haunted, and finally disappeared without a trace. The last lines were clear. If you are reading this, the lake has chosen you. There is no escape. I wanted to exit the page, but the mouse did not move, the keyboard did not respond. On the screen, new lines automatically appeared. We are watching you. I panicked and pulled out the power cord. But when the screen turned off, in the dark glass, I saw the face of the woman from the lake. Her creepy smile clearly printed. Since then, my computer has become a new portal. Every time I turn it on, I see mysterious lines. They recount exactly what I have experienced that day, every detail without a single mistake. Then they continue to write about what will happen next, like a predetermined death scenario. I read with a cold body, because I know every time the line appears, I will have to relive it in reality. Like I was the main character in an auto-completion creepypasta the night. I was looking at the screen when the video came on. The scene was my bedroom, with me sitting motionless on the bed. Behind me was the silhouette of a woman, her eyes dark and hollow, her hand on my shoulder. I screamed, but in the video, I was still sitting there, not reacting. I quickly turned around. My back was empty. But when I looked at the screen, her face was close to the lens, her mouth smiling widely. I threw the computer to the ground, but even as the screen shattered, I could still see the image of the lake reflected in the glass. Shards, I realized I had become part of a living oral story. Every action, every moment of mine was being recorded somewhere, turned into a piece of creepypasta that others would read and shudder at. But for me, this was no longer a reading for entertainment. This was real life. This was overwhelming fear, and I couldn't escape it. To outsiders, I might think I've lost my mind. But if anyone's listening, I want to make it clear. The stories you read online might not be just imagination. They might be real fragments from places like that lake. And as you read these lines, you might be unwittingly becoming a part of it. Remember, some creepypastas are not written by humans, but by unseen forces to spread fear and draw more souls. After several sleepless nights, I decided to leave the house that had become part of the lake. I thought that if I went far away, camped somewhere else, I might be able to escape this haunting. It seemed silly, but in desperation, people are willing to cling to any ray of hope. I prepared a small tent, some food, and left town that afternoon, heading deeper into another forest, far from where the lake had appeared. I told myself that camping here would at least give me peace for one night. When the sun set, I lit a fire at the edge of the forest. The flickering light made me feel somewhat safer. The chirping of insects, the smell of burning wood, and the fresh air made me have the illusion that I had truly escaped the curse. I set up my tent, sat by the fire, and tried to convince myself that tonight would be different. But then, as the night wind picked up, I heard a familiar sound. At first there was the rustling of leaves, then the steady dripping of water. I looked around. The sky was still dry, but the sound kept ringing. Echoing from deep in the forest, shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound. And my heart stopped when I saw a long streak of water on the ground, running straight into the dark space in the middle of the forest. I tried to ignore it, returning to the fire, but the sound became clearer and clearer, like footsteps wading in a puddle. The fire flickered, then suddenly went out, leaving me in the thick darkness. I turned on the flashlight, the shaky light shining straight into the empty space, where a shadow stood motionless. The familiar figure of a woman, long hair soaked, empty black eyes staring at me. I backed away, my heart pounding. The figure did not move, but water dripped from her body to the ground, forming a wide puddle. I rushed straight into the tent, zipped it up, and hugged the knife tightly. The sound of dripping water was heard outside, and then a faint whisper began to be heard. A distorted, drawn-out voice repeated my name over and over again. I closed my eyes, trying to cover my ears, but the voice gradually turned into a wild laughter, echoing throughout the forest. In the middle of the night, I woke up from a cold feeling. Water had flooded into the tent, soaking my clothes and blankets. I jumped up and rushed outside, but the sight before me froze me. Right next to the campsite, the lake appeared, its still surface reflecting the moonlight. I realized the terrible truth. The lake did not stay in one place. It followed me, moved with me, and wherever I stopped, it appeared to swallow May ran out of the camp in a panic, leaving everything behind. But the more I ran, the more I heard the sound of water following me. Looking around, I saw dripping trees, puddles of water with human footprints. I no longer knew where I was. All roads led me back to the lake, even though I ran in the opposite direction. I screamed in despair, but only the wind and a twisted laugh answered. As dawn approached, I collapsed from exhaustion. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in the tent again, next to the extinguished fire. But around the tent, the ground was soaked, streaked with water as if someone had been standing there all night. I knew that there was no safe place anymore. Camping did not help me escape. It only gave the lake another chance to prove that it would follow me to the ends of the earth. I no longer dared to try to escape, because wherever I ran, it would find me. I could only tell, hoping that someone would hear and stay away. Because once you set up camp in the dark, listening to the whispers mixed with the wind, you will know that you are no longer alone. And then you will remember my story, a man who accidentally fell into the curse and had to live his whole life in fear of being swallowed by the lake. After the failed camping trip, I understood that I could not escape. The lake was no longer confined to a specific location. It followed me like a shadow, like an indelible memory. I walked on the streets of the town, but the cold feeling from the soles of my feet still rose, as if I were walking on water. Passers-by did not notice anything, but I knew clearly. I had become a haunted person, forever unable to escape the sight of the lake every night. No matter where I was, strange phenomena still followed me. I rented a small room far away from the old town, thinking that I could rest here temporarily. But on the first night, when the clock struck 3 a.m., the familiar knocking sound rang out again. I sat there, stunned, knife in hand, trembling. The door opened slowly without me touching it, and from the hallway, a long streak of water led straight inside. I looked, saw a shadow moving across the wall, leaving streaks on the paint. As I ran, the room suddenly became cold, and I knew the lake had found me again in the following days. I began to notice the smallest signs. Steam condensed into fingers on the bathroom mirror. In my sleep, I heard someone whispering my name right next to my ear. When I woke up, the bedsheets were soaked. My hair was stuck to the surface of the lake. I was tired, exhausted, but I couldn't help but write down what had happened. I knew that this story was not only a warning, but also the final proof that I had ever existed. Because when I disappeared, no one would remember who I was once. I tried to go further, to a big city where people were bustling and lights were bright. I thought the noise could cover everything, but in fact, it only made the haunting more prominent. In the middle of the traffic, I heard the sound of water trickling right next to my ear. In the sea of people, I saw drenched figures weaving through, their empty eyes staring straight at me. I ran through each street in panic, but wherever I went, I still saw the lake reflected in the glass windows of the buildings. I no longer belonged to this world, but was a part of the darkness that was clinging to me. People often say haunted means a house, a forest, or an abandoned building. But I understood the scarier truth. A person can also be haunted. I am the proof. Every place I passed by was transformed, carrying the lake's deadly mark. I was no longer a passerby, but a haunter. I looked into the eyes of the people around me and saw the fear they had for me, even though they didn't know the reason. Perhaps they just sensed that I carried something that didn't belong to this world tonight. I sat writing in a dark room, listening to the sound of rain falling outside the window. But I knew it wasn't normal rain. It was the sound of the lake, seeping through the walls to call me back. I could no longer resist. I saw my face in the mirror gradually fade, replaced by the silhouette of that woman. Her smile grew wider, more ferocious, while my eyes lost their light. I tremble as I write these lines, because this may be the last time I will be myself. If you are listening, know that this haunting does not end when you leave the lake. It follows you, clings to you, becomes a part of you, because once you see it, you are haunted forever. And then, no light, no city, no crowd can save you from the cold silence of that unmapped lake. After months of being haunted by the lake, I began to look for answers in older sources. I went to the town library, a place rarely visited, dust covering every shelf. In a hidden corner, I found a cracked wooden box with a faded label, Unnamed Lake. My heart pounding, I opened it and found a pile of files, old newspapers, and scribbled handwritten notes. Each piece of paper was a hidden true story of disappeared people, broken families, and unexplained curses. An old newspaper from the 1950s recorded the disappearance of a family of 6 after a picnic. The police found the tent and belongings intact, but no trace of them. Only one detail made everyone shiver. On the ground around the camp, there were streaks of water that stretched into the woods. The article ended with the sentence, "Perhaps they got lost in a lake that was not on the map." I shuddered as I read it, because the story was exactly like my camping experience. Another note, written in a shaky hand, told of a hunter who lived in the 19th century. He wrote that one night while hunting, he came across a strange lake that did not appear on local maps. He saw silhouettes of people looming in the water, and then heard the sound of children giggling. When he returned to tell the story, no one believed him. A few days later, his bow and arrows and belongings were found on the edge of the forest, but his body was never found. The more I read, the more I shuddered. Every page, every news report told of people who had mysteriously disappeared, and they all had one thing in common: the lake. These true stories were never made public, because the authorities were afraid of causing panic. But they still exist here, hidden in the darkness. As a reminder that those souls have never been free, took some of the files back to my room to continue reading. That night, sitting at the table, I spread out the papers. But as soon as I turned to a page containing a survivor's testimony, the room suddenly became cold. She wrote that as a child, she had seen the lake and been pulled in. But strangely, she was released to survive as a witness. She said that she heard a whisper, "You will tell the story for me." and her whole life was haunted by knocks on the door in the middle of the night. I shivered, because that story was no different from what I was experiencing when I put the papers down on the table. I was startled to see that the table was soaked. The words on the page were smeared, but strangely, the image of the lake appeared clearly in the middle of the page. In that water, I saw the silhouette of a woman, her long hair covering her face, her deep eyes looking at me. I screamed and threw the papers on the floor, but when I picked them up, they were dry, the writing was clear, and there was no water stain. I understood that the lake knew I had discovered the truth, and it wanted to warn me not to reveal it. In the following days, I continued to research, and I realized more and more that the lake was not a natural phenomenon. It was a portal, a trap that swallowed up those who dared to look into it, and the world had deliberately buried this evidence to avoid spreading fear. But the truth is, those true stories cannot be buried forever. I am living proof, and my story is just the next in a long line of forgotten fates. Now, I sat in the dark room, files spread out on the table. I knew that soon I would become another page in that wooden box, another name on the list of missing people. And then someone will open the box, reread my story, and realize with a shiver that the lake is still there, still waiting, still swallowing. That is how it lives, through true stories that the world willfully forgets but never disappears. As I continued reading the old records, I began to see a new pattern that kept recurring. Not everyone was a random victim of the lake. Some of the people who disappeared were related to past sins. The shaky inscriptions showed that the spirits in the lake carried an unquenchable anger, as if they had been betrayed, murdered, or wrongfully buried. They were not only trapped, they were thirsty for revenge. And I, somehow, had unwittingly stirred that Ragian, one of the documents. I read the story of a man who had been a landowner in this area. He was known for his cruelty, exploiting the poor, even seizing plots of land on the edge of the forest. One night, he and his family disappeared without a trace. People found the villa abandoned, the furniture intact, but the floor stained with water. Rumors spread that the lake had swallowed him and turned him into one of the vengeful ghosts. The story was exactly like the revenge stories on the internet, but Calder, because it was true, began to realize something. Every night when the ghosts appeared around me, their eyes were not only filled with despair, there was also anger, hatred that had been suppressed for many years. They looked at me, not as a stranger, but as if I were the representative of those who had harmed them. They wanted me to pay. I trembled before that gaze, because it was not like ordinary fear, but a burning anger that burned to the core one night. I dreamed that I was standing in the middle of a lake, surrounded by dozens of shadows. They no longer screamed, but pointed at me in unison. A whisper echoed everywhere. You will replace, you will suffer. I struggled, but cold hands grabbed me, pinned me down into the water. In that moment, I realized the terrible truth. I had been chosen to bear the resentment they carried. I will be the next person in the series of revenge stories of Hother next morning. I woke up in a state of exhaustion, my whole body bruised as if it had been squeezed by dozens of hands. I looked in the mirror, my eyes were dark, my face looked much older. Something inside was slowly being sucked out, replaced by invisible anger. I began to hear voices in my head, urging me to do bad things. I was scared, but at the same time, I clearly felt that I was being transformed. I was no longer just a victim. I was becoming a tool in Ho's revenging the following days. I found myself gradually losing control. One day, when I was passing through an alley, I saw a strange man. Suddenly, a strong urge rose in me, forcing me to want to hurt him, as if the voice in my head was giving me an order. I trembled and ran away, but the laughter echoed in my ears, and I almost collapsed. I understand that I carry the hatred of those souls within me, and one day I will no longer be able to resist now. As I sit here writing these lines, I know that I have very little time left. My story is not only a warning, but also a testament to the existence of a never-ending series of revenge stories. Those souls want justice, but their justice is distorted, leaving only blood and tears. I do not know how I will disappear, but I will certainly no longer be myself. I will only be a new whisper, a new shadow in that dark water, waiting for the next person to step in if anyone hears this story. Remember that the lake does not just swallow randomly. It chooses its victims, it nurtures its resentment, and then turns them into tools to continue its chain of revenge. Once you see the lake, you not only see death, but also see the anger of generations. And then you will understand what a vivid revenge story is, where you no longer have the right to choose your fate. I know this will be the last time I can write. These past few days, I felt my body slowly fading away, each breath heavy as if being drowned in water. It was no longer a fleeting illusion, but the stark truth. I belonged to the lake from the first moment I saw it. I tried to escape, tried to resist, tried to call for help, but all of it only led me back to the starting point. And now, I sit before this page, in the cold room, hearing whispers echoing from all four walls. Tonight, I opened my eyes and looked around, and realized I was no longer in the rented room. I was standing by the familiar lake, the red moonlight shining on the still water. The space was so quiet it was scary, because there was no wind, no sound, only my heart beating rapidly. I knew this was where I would end up. The lake surface began to ripple. Silhouettes of people slowly emerged. They were no longer screaming, no longer desperate. They stood in a long line, their lifeless eyes staring at me, as if waiting for me to join Thema. Woman with long hair stepped out of the water, dripping, her eyes sunken. She held out her hand to me, her smile wide. I had no strength to back away. Her hand was cold but strong, holding mine tightly. In that moment, a series of memories that did not belong to me rushed back. I saw people betrayed, abandoned, swallowed by the lake. I heard screams, swearing, desperate cries for help. And I understood that I had become the next part of that story. The water began to rise around my legs. I shivered, but I did not resist. I knew it was inevitable. Waves of cold water washed over me, pulling me down. When my head hit the water, everything went dark, but I still heard a familiar whisper, "Welcome." I opened my eyes in the pitch-black water, seeing hundreds of faces surrounding me. No longer afraid, only resigned. I understood that this was the scary end the lake had planned for me long ago. The world on the shore faded away, further and further away, as I was pulled deeper into the depths. I saw the last light disappear, and then there was only absolute darkness. But in that darkness, I still thought, still felt, as if I had never really disappeared. I had become one of them, a soul forever drifting beneath the surface of the nameless lake. And from now on, I will also wait, looking for the next person who accidentally passed through this gate. If you hear this story, consider it a final warning. Never look for the lake that is not on the map, because once you have found it, your fate is sealed. You will become one of us, forever trapped under the cold water with no way out. And then you will understand what the scary truth is. The truth that no one dares to tell in its entirety and here, because there is nothing more to write. These words may be my last legacy. If you are still safe when you hear them, remember, do not be curious, do not challenge, do not search, because the scariest truth is that there are places that are not on the map, but exist to swallow those who dare to look at it. And the first, an innocent person, had become the final proof of that.